My name is Adam Bushakiewicz.
And I'm Aaron Manning, and we're historians of Warwick Castle.
This series looks at short stories of the owners of and objects in Warwick Castle. Born in 1554 and died in 1628, Sir Fulke Greville, First Lord Brooke, is arguably one of Warwickshire's greatest sons. He was a courtier, a diplomat, a politician, a jouster, and also Chancellor of the Exchequer to James I. In addition to these worldly pursuits, he was also a poet, a sonneteer, a playwright, and a patron. He saved Warwick Castle from dereliction after it was granted to him in 1604, and went on to transform the building into a beautiful home for his heirs. In this podcast, I hope to prove to you why Sir Fulke Greville is one of Warwickshire's most underrated historical figures.
So before we get on to Fulke Greville's remarkable life and career, Adam, it's probably best to get one thing out of the way. I think it's the one thing that a lot of people will be listening for and almost everybody knows about Fulke Greville, and that's the story of his gruesome death in 1628 at the age of 74. What can you tell us about this?
Yeah, so if there's one story that literally follows Fulke Greville around, it's probably the story about his gruesome murder right at the end of his life, after this remarkable career that he had at the courts of not only Elizabeth I but James I. He was murdered by his manservant, a man called Ralph Heywood. The story revolves around a trip to London he made to rewrite his will, where supposedly his servant was upset at the fact that his master was only going to leave him £20 a year in his will, so decided, while Sir Fulke Greville was doing up his trousers one morning, to stab him several times in the stomach. You know, this is really the stuff of horror films, I think, because although Ralph Heywood locked himself away in a cupboard and killed himself straight after this nasty incident, Sir Fulke Greville took over 20 days to die. And indeed, this horrific story has led to all sorts of, I think, conspiracy theories and fanciful imaginations, including the fact that his ghost restlessly still haunts Warwick Castle, his ancient home in Warwickshire. In fact, in 2004, the current owners of Warwick Castle opened an attraction specifically to tell this story and got lots of actors dressed in gruesome makeup and costumes to reenact this murder that, by the way, happened over 100 miles away in London, again and again and again, to paying visitors. It was very popular with visitors, in fact, and also the Warwick Castle's accounting department. But what it really did do was brush over the life of this fantastically interesting figure from Warwickshire's past. A few years ago, Aaron, you decided to actually look into to really work out how old this ghost story is, didn't you? And what did you find?
Yes, you're right, I did. And, you know, the topic of ghosts might be something we come back to in a later podcast, but specifically on the Fulke Greville one, what I found quite interesting is in the late 19th century, when ghost hunting was very popular. It's recorded in books written by Daisy and Francis, the 5th Earl and Countess of Warwick. In all of the kind of late 19th century accounts of ghosts, Fulke makes no appearance, which is bonkers. And the earliest reference we found to the story of Fulke Greville's ghost came in the 1930s. And I think it's quite interesting that it was at that period where the family are so reliant now on tourist intake. And so getting people to come to a castle, supposedly a haunted castle, was a great piece of marketing and really took effect in the 60s, 70s, when the Watergate Tower, which is an old medieval tower but kind of decorated in 17th century interiors, became known as the Ghost Tower.
Yes, it's such a shame that a ghost story that is barely 100 years old has gotten in the way of a much better story about arguably one of Warwickshire's most significant historical figures.
So back to Fulke's life. Let's go back to the beginning. Talk to me a little bit about Fulke's background, his family history.
So Fulke Greville was actually born in 1554, but the Greville family have a much more ancient history that stretches back into England's past. Indeed, the Grevilles were believed to be knights who came over from Normandy with William the Conqueror nearly 1,000 years ago. There's a place called Greville in Normandy, in fact. But when they got here, the Grevilles really made their mark as wool merchants in the Cotswolds, particularly in the beautiful town of Chipping Campden. There still remains today a very ancient house on the high street there known as Greville House, Now, it's quite confusing because Sir Fulke Greville's grandfather and father were all named Fulke. So it requires a bit of explanation, I think. Sir Fulke Greville's grandfather, Sir Fulke number one, I should probably call him, was the son of another famous Greville who had really gotten himself involved in the administration not only of Warwickshire but also of neighbouring Worcestershire as well, and was also a great Protestant knight to Henry VIII, we are told in the history books. But more importantly than Sir Fulke Greville's grandfather was his grandmother, Elizabeth Willoughby. Now, she was an heiress, and she brought into the family no fewer than 32 manors in 8 counties, which really did set up the Greville family to become one of Warwickshire's most influential dynasties, which our Sir Fulke Greville would certainly build on. If Sir Fulke, as a young boy, actually went to go and see their tomb in St. Nicholas's Church in Ulster, he would also have been reminded of the great dynasty that he descended from. Elizabeth Willoughby, in fact, was a descendant of several very important Warwickshire noble families, including the Beauchamps, who, of course, were the Earls of Warwick in the 13th and 14th centuries, one of the most powerful families in all of medieval England. And I think this would have really been at the back of his mind, that he came from very important stock, and would have certainly made his later acquisition of Warwick Castle very significant in dynastic terms, I would argue.
So whereabouts in Warwickshire was he born?
He was born inside a medieval manor house just outside of the town of Ulster, just north of Stratford-upon-Avon, in a manor called Beauchamp Court. Again, the name of this manor harks back to that family in which he descends from. Indeed, when he was born in 1554, his father, Sir Fulke Greville number 2, was only 18 years old at the time, so there was actually very little age difference between them. Sir Fulke Greville number 2, our Fulke's father, was also a man of great interest. He was knighted by none other than the great Robert Dudley at Kenilworth Castle in the 1560s. He was a very key figure in the history and politics of Stratford-upon-Avon. He would have almost certainly have known Shakespeare's father, for example. Sir Fulke Greville number 2 was also, I think, a man who really enjoyed the frivolities and worldly things of life. He is known to have been very interested in sport, including the likes of bear baiting, for example, in Warwickshire, which he is connected with. He also kept with him a band of men, which are believed to have been actors. So, again, he is in very bohemian circles. His inventory shows that he had enormous amounts of musical instruments in Beauchamp Court. So you can imagine that this household that our Sir Fulke Greville is born into is quite artistically minded and culturally minded. And this is also a bit of a conflict with the fact that the Grevilles are also very hardened Protestants, which I think must have also played on this young boy's mind. He later actually described his father's life as being one that was continually tarnished by the company that he kept and the fact that he was too easily drawn to pleasure. And when he died in 1606, left lots of debts for his poor son to clean up. So I think it's a very interesting background that our Sir Fulke Greville had.
So I imagine Fulke, coming from quite a bohemian background, would have gone to school then?
Yes, fortunately for him, his family did value education, and around the age of 10, Sir Fulke was sent off as a young boy, where he was simply known as Master Greville at that point, to Shrewsbury School. Why was he sent off to Shrewsbury? Well, it's probably because his family were trying to make connections with one of the most powerful families in Tudor England at that time, the famous Sidney family, who had connections through marriage to the even more powerful Dudley family, who throughout the 16th century held the dukedom of Northumberland, but more importantly later both the earldoms of Leicester and Warwick. Our Master Greville actually enrolled in Shrewsbury School on the exact same day as the most singular figure probably in his entire life, his future best friend and one might almost say soulmate, Philip Sidney. So Philip Sidney has this very important and special place in Elizabethan England. He was known as really one of the great Protestant knights of that period, who was devoted to the Protestant cause and also protecting the kingdoms of England from Spanish and Catholic influence. and quickly made himself one of Queen Elizabeth I's favoured courtiers. Fulke Greville would later write a biography of his very famous friend, and it seems that their schooling together made such an important impression on him. And in fact, throughout his life, he continually was reminded of the heroism and the spotless character that his friend had, or he believed to have had.
So I imagine being quite close to the Sidneys may have given Fulke access to court as well then.
Yes, although Sir Fulke Greville was sent off to Jesus College, Cambridge, and Sidney was sent off to Christ Church in Oxford, the pair remained incredibly close, and it was undoubtedly through the Sidneys' influence that Sir Fulke Greville, Master Greville as he then was, of course, the first most important job at Elizabeth's court, which was a very minor position really, which was clerk of the signet to the Council of the Marches in Wales, a minor but significant position which allowed him to be around Elizabeth's court. And the way that Elizabeth's court worked really was almost like a solar system. She was the sun, and her male courtiers particularly would gather around her like planets. All life and light, and also importantly money, came from her, and she had the power to keep them close where they would prosper, or alternatively throw them out of this solar system into barrenness, wilderness, and debt.
So other than a job then, what other influences did Sidney have over Fulke?
One of the most important influences that Sidney had over Sir Fulke Greville was that of poetry in the English language. Sidney is always held up as a vital figure in the history of the English language because he was one of the first writers to promote the fact that poetry, sonnets, could be written in the English language and be just as beautiful as Italian examples in particular. So Fulke Greville became an intimate part of Sidney's poetic circle, which included other figures like Dyer as well, particularly honed in around Wilton House, which is where Sidney's sister Mary lived. Scholars writing on Sidney and Greville's poetry actually find a great deal of connections between the two men's work. It seems that they almost sat next to each other at certain points and wrote poems on exactly the same themes, and you can compare them as such. Sidney is very much, though, an idealist in the sense that subjects like love and desire were held up by him to be one of man's greatest attributes, yet Sir Fulke Greville, on the other hand, is often very pessimistic towards love. He writes lots of beautiful sonnets, I should say, as a young man, about the inconstancy of love and desire, the fact that it is continually corrupted. For example, one of my favourite sonnets is about his love, Myra, who had made him all of these promises, yet right at the end breaks it off. And it ends with the lines that no man can print a kiss and lines may deceive. The idea that these youthful mutterings of love when you're young in fields and in these bucolic landscapes which Fulke Greville and Sidney enjoyed as young men, these are all worthless at the end of the day. You can't print and prove them. You can very easily go back on your word, which I think makes the case that Fulke Greville as a young man must have had many love affairs, which didn't always end up so sweetly indeed. Furthermore, I think Fulke Greville and Sidney together aspired for great fame and adventure at Elizabeth's court. One of the things that Elizabeth was always not very keen to do was to send her favourites out into dangerous circumstances, and Fulke Greville and Sidney were always, I think, terribly frustrated at this. There's one story that they even tried to jump onto a ship that Sir Francis Drake was preparing to set off to the Americas to expand colonies and that sort of thing. But when the Queen had found out that her two young boys, Fulke and Philip, were stowaways on board without her permission, she immediately sent after them, and they were, I think, chastised when they returned back to court for this very naughty thing that they had done. So you really get that sense that they're two young men who are going out in the world seeking adventure, fortune, are interested in promoting the Protestant cause, which they believed in passionately.
You really get the sense that these are almost more than best friends, aren't they? They're kind of brothers and share so much in common. Gosh, I can only imagine what Fulke must have felt then when that awful, terrible event happened in 1586.
Yes, unfortunately, at the Battle of Zutphen in 1586, Philip Sidney, Fulke Greville's best friend, was killed in action. And I think Fulke must have felt very sad about it anyway, because Sidney was off in the Netherlands fighting with his uncle Robert Dudley, and Fulke Greville was practically left at home to wallow about it. Sidney was having all the fun, but this ended in his very premature death. And with this death, I think, came Sir Fulke Greville's first great crisis of his life. His youthful, heroic friend, who embodied so many great virtues, had his life snuffed out. Fulke Greville was so keen that nobody should ever forget his great friend, and so he started to set about writing a biography of his great friend, almost using Sidney's life as a pattern that other great heroic men should follow, which would be one of the leitmotifs of Greville's thought and work later in his life too. Although the biography was never published in his lifetime, you imagine that he really wanted to memorialize his friend in some meaningful and significant way.
So who did Fulke attach himself to next?
Well, it seems rather quickly afterwards, Sir Fulke found another great heroic gentleman who was going to take up the mantle of his great heroic friend Sir Philip Sidney, and that was Robert Devereux, the second Earl of Essex. Essex is a very mysterious and curious figure, I think. He was really connected with Sidney's mantle in so many ways. For example, Fulke and Essex actually performed in this magnificent joust shortly after Sidney's death, where they dressed in black and trying to evoke the spirit of this great knight of England who had died on a foreign battlefield. You know, this very dramatic moment. Essex too actually had married Sidney's widow, which is a very weird thing for us to imagine today, but you know, this is the age of chivalry that they were trying to evoke. So Essex was really trying to connect himself in blood terms as well to Sidney's mantle. And in Essex, Greville saw, I think, another heroic soldier who would go off and particularly fight for the Protestantism. Indeed, Greville actually lived in Essex's house on the Strand in London. This house was formerly occupied by Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, in fact. He had his own bedroom there, his own stuff. And indeed, Essex actually referred to Greville as my cousin, although I don't think they were related in blood. But they too were very, very close, as you might imagine.
And so did Fulke's friendship with Essex achieve any gains at court in Fulke's career?
Yes, very much so. In 1598, Fulke was actually made Treasurer to the Navy, which was a very significant position in late Elizabethan England. This was a great period of exploration where English ships were travelling from Portsmouth and other places and reaching the far ends of the world. This was the great era for international trade of English ships. And we know through many letters that Fulke Greville was very interested in this. He was encouraging the foundling East India Company to go off and spread across the world and to make connections with far-off places such as India, all in the name of trade. Earlier on in his career, in fact, Fulke Greville was actually the captain of several ships as well. I think the Navy had great interest for him, perhaps due to its connotations to do with adventure and all those exciting sorts of things. It was in this position that Greville really made himself out to be a very good and able administrator, which was also a motif that would follow him throughout his life. It seems he was very good at dealing with bureaucracy and checking accounts and that sort of thing. He had also very good help in doing this. So this position was vital for his rise in the court of Elizabeth I.
Yeah, of course, Fulke had so many benefits then from Essex friendship. So what do you think Fulke would have made of Essex' quite dramatic fall?
Yes, this age-old comparison between the Earl of Essex and Icarus, that young boy who with his wax wings flew too close to the sun and fell crashing into the sea. I think this fall of Essex in 1601 left Fulke Greville with a very significant crisis. Here again was another young man who was full of so much hope, so much Protestant heroism, who had been corrupted by power, also by the bad company that he kept around him, and had really proved to be such a disappointment. And the great sadness of of Fulke Greville's life also was that he was one of the men who was actually sent to Essex House to go and arrest the Earl of Essex. So could you imagine, having to be sent to this house where you in fact had a room and having to arrest the man who you would call your own cousin? And lots of Essex's later followers would have publicly denounced him, but it seems that Fulke Greville was very careful not to do so, in very open terms at least. But in his subtle ways, he later in fact wrote a play based around the story of Antony and Cleopatra, which he is said to have burned, in fact, because he believed it came far too close to describing the relationship between Essex and Elizabeth. So I think it's wonderful how this deep crisis that the downfall of Essex left him with really did influence his thought, his writing, and also gave him great modes of expression and thought about what it is to be a man full of corruption and so easily misled by our desires for fame and power.
Yeah, Fulke thankfully did survive Essex's fall, didn't he? And I guess in part this was probably because he was quite close to the Queen, Elizabeth I. In fact, she knighted him. I think the records show that she wanted this, Warwickshire man to be around her court quite a lot.
Yes, in those last few years, we even have letters from Robert Cecil, her chief minister, writing about the fact that Fulke Greville, this man from Warwickshire who was involved at a distance but still formally connected with this traitorous figure Essex, was really indispensable to the aging Queen. And I can imagine exactly why. Perhaps Fulke reminded her of all of these figures who had come and gone, like Sidney, like Essex. Perhaps she even regretted Essex's execution in 1601. And so right towards the end of her life, it seems that Fulke Greville was increasing his stock at Elizabeth's court. But unfortunately, her death quickly ended all of this.
The next reigning dynasty didn't bring much luck for Fulke either, I guess, because, of course, James I arrived in England in 1603, bringing with him a whole court of Scotsmen. And I guess the court itself had lots of clawing hands of people trying to gain promotion with a brand new monarch with brand new ideas.
This was absolutely a disaster for Fulke Greville. In 1604, he was removed from his position of Treasurer of the Navy. And I think Robert Cecil in particular is blamed for his downfall. Robert was, I think, very jealous, but also very suspicious of Fulke Greville, particularly in those last years of Elizabeth's reign, for example. And so when this new Stuart king arrived, he was very quickly brushed aside and really, I think, brushed under the carpet. This loss of office was a disastrous thing for Fulke Greville. He was in his late 40s at this period, and imagine again, he didn't know at this point that he would live another few decades. So many more men had actually never even seen their late 40s because of life expectancy and all sorts of other reasons. So I think Fulke Greville might have thought at this period that, well, this might be the end of my life and career. What have I achieved? Very little. This eternal frustration, again, was causing him great anxiety.
But saying that, there was a great consolation prize he did manage to get, wasn't there?
In 1604, Sir Fulke Greville was actually granted the ownership of Warwick Castle. And this probably requires a bit of explanation. I've already outlined the fact that Sir Fulke really truly believed that he was the great inheritor, dynastically at least, of the Beauchamp legacy. That is, he believed that he was an ancestor of these great medieval Earls of Warwick. And by the late 16th century, well, the Dudleys have owned Warwick Castle, but already after the death of Ambrose Dudley in 1590, this beautiful and ancient castle was already falling into ruin.
It's probably worth mentioning at this point as well, I guess, that Warwick Castle at this point was far from the kind of glorious medieval fortress that it had been, and subsequently not yet the great country house that it turned out to be. Because throughout the 16th century, even though, as you rightly say, it was owned by the Dudleys, the castle really wasn't well cared for and looked after. In fact, there's that brilliant survey, I think, that made in 1590 and another one later in the early 1600s that talks a lot about the kind of ruinous state of the castle. I think the roofs had been stripped of its lead, the interiors were rotten, a lot of the windows, I think, had fallen out. The stonework was crumbling. I mean, you really get the impression that it's a ruin and hardly fit to house any family, let alone a man who is used to splendour and comfort, as he imagine would have got in London. And of course, it's amazing to think that, in one survey of the castle at this time, it was actually valued just over, I think, £400 to sell off the stone, to demolish it. In fact, there'd be no castle today if a different owner had taken control of the castle at this point. But of course, that didn't happen, and Fulke obviously was quite instrumental in that. And according to William Dugdale, he spent the equivalent of £20,000, am I right, in restoring and renovating the castle.
Sir Fulke Greville spent £20,000 of his own money, we're told, on transforming it into a beautiful house for his heirs. Obviously, this grand setting would have been a place that he would have admired. Who couldn't be admired by such a beautiful place? But I think also Sir Fulke Greville was a great historian, and I'm convinced personally myself that he must have looked at this ruin and thought, my word, here is a building imbued with so much history that really deserves preserving, not only for dynastic reasons, I think, but also symbolically, let's say. We know from later inventories that Fulke Greville not only made the outsides beautiful by repairing stonework, but filled it with beautiful rooms laden with fine furniture, beds trimmed with damask silks fringed in silver and gold. He filled it also with fine furniture made of ebony and other exotic materials. He also kept lots of musical instruments at Warwick Castle and also in his London homes, not to mention his vast libraries too. One of the most expensive things he purchased and filled Warwick Castle and his London homes with was fine tapestries. And still surviving in Warwick Castle today, we have a set of marvellous tapestries woven in Delft, dated to 1604, in fact, the same year that he was granted Warwick Castle, of beautiful mannerist gardens. These undoubtedly descended with Warwick Castle from Fulke's period. I think his spirit would have been greatly admired by the likes of William Morris, these later key figures in the conservation movement in architecture.
Alongside some of the improvement works he did at Warwick Castle, then, what else was he getting up to in his so-called retirement?
Well, I think it's clear from surviving records that Fulke was keenly involved in what we might call today estate management, particularly in aggrandizing, making various improvements and organizing the accounts of his various estates that were by this point spread throughout the country. But also, I think one of the facts that never ceases to amaze me, that by the early 17th century, he owned actually no fewer than about 5 homes in London alone. So can you imagine the wealth, I think, that he was starting to accumulate, all due to diligent accounting, mostly. He was also sent off by Cecil to go and make surveys of important houses and buildings. I think he was keenly connected to architects and otherwise men who were able to look after ancient buildings, which, of course, restoring Warwick Castle had also given him a mutual interest in, I think.
But Fulke's retirement was broken, wasn't it, by a miraculous event that happened in 1612?
Yes, although Fulke had quite a strange and curious relationship with Robert Cecil, I don't think he could have ever foresaw that in 1612 Cecil died. And indeed, Ronald Rebholz, Fulke Greville's greatest biographer, had really explained that it was Cecil who was keeping Fulke Greville back from public office and key positions at court. With the death of Cecil came great opportunities to once again get himself involved in the politics of the country.
You can so imagine that, actually, can't you? Because it's amazing to think that just 2 years after Cecil's death, Fulke had managed to squeeze himself into the position of Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Money made the world go around in the 17th century as much as it does today. And it's quite amazing that into his 50s at this point, Sir Fulke Greville had made a remarkable comeback into one of the most key positions at court. James was notoriously bad with money. Unlike Elizabeth, James and his family, his very large family, knew how to spend it. And so you might imagine that Fulke, by this point, was one of those trusted, wise old men who was probably considered to be quite good with money and estates. And this is the chap that we should get running the Exchequer. One of the great tasks that Fulke was given was reforming the country's finances, which he started with a tremendously ferocious energy.
And it's in this context that James I then would have visited Fulke in Warwick in September 1617 then.
James actually had come to Warwick to visit Sir Fulke Greville and his beautiful castle, which was probably nearing completion at this point, if not already finished. And the reason for doing so undoubtedly was to ask Sir Fulke Greville to go even deeper with reforms into the country's finances. James had notoriously been humiliated just after his progress of Scotland because of his inability to pay the various expenses that were required on such a very lavish set of travels that he had undertaken. So there's this wonderful speech which Fulke Greville is known to have given James, which I think reminds us of what a dramatic and, I think, creative spirit that Fulke Greville had around him. The speech that survives is almost worthy, I think, of a Shakespearean text, which charts the history of this castle, its once great medieval earls, yet sad decline into the Tudor age, and once again is receiving the light and life of monarchy, which is exactly charting Fulke Greville's career almost. And I think really goes to show what a magnificent command of the English language Sir Fulke Greville had, which you can really get a sense of from reading his poetry and sonnets of this period.
And so did all these reforms go to plan?
Alas, although Fulke managed to make enormous savings in the treasury, it wasn't enough to really help get James out of his problems. And already by the late 16 teens, it was old age and poor health that was really making life very difficult for this aging courtier. He continued very interesting friendships as well during this period. He was eventually ennobled in 1621 and given the title Baron Brooke of Beauchamp Court, which must have, I think, made him very proud of the position that he had finally given his family and his later heirs to inherit. And it's intriguing too that this, what by now was quite an elderly 60-year-old man, even continued to make friendships in other places too. We know that he was a friend of the incredibly powerful George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, a great favourite of James I and also later Charles I. Indeed, they wrote to each other these very curiously friendly letters to each other. So Fulke Greville referred to himself as the grandchild and Buckingham was the grandfather. Very weird relationship, I think, that they had. And I think in Buckingham, he too saw again this youthful, heroic figure who was very keen on promoting Protestantism throughout Europe, and particularly in the resurgence of a renewed aggressive policy, particularly against Spain, which Buckingham and Charles were pursuing after the disastrous plans of a Spanish marriage. So it's very intriguing that Fulke Greville was right into old age, into his late 60s, was still getting involved.
And of course, that means he spent a lot more time in London. And it's during this period, right, that he's buying lots of more property in London. And like you said, he's spending money renovating, restoring this fabulous house, Brooke House, formerly Bath House. And there's stories of incredible gardens there, aren't there, of water features and marble fountains and planting.
It seems definitely that Fulke Greville admired and loved gardens. There's this wonderful text that is preserved, which is a poem that a Bishop Corbet wrote after visiting Warwick Castle, in fact, where he describes the beautiful orchards and plants that this Chancellor had strewn all over the castle and its grounds to really transform it into a place of beauty. The idea that this castle, a building once known for being a place of military, had been transformed into this beautiful home full of luxury, I think, is something that everyone was terribly impressed by. Bishop Corbet writes that all the words that Fulke Greville spoke were of wine and music. The idea that his command of the English language and his manners were celebrated too, I think, is worth noting. But you're right, coming back to the London house, indeed, it's believed by many architectural historians that Brooke House in Holborn was in fact redesigned by none other than the great Inigo Jones. There's one drawing that survives in the Royal Institute of British Architects, and also it's been connected to another drawing at Chatsworth by Jones, which I think makes a case for how fashionable and Fulke Greville was in commissioning, really the cutting edge of classical architecture in early 17th century Britain. It's perhaps no coincidence that Fulke Greville was on the committee who were going to appoint Jones as the new designer of the new banqueting hall in Whitehall, considered to be one of the greatest classical buildings ever erected in Britain.
So, of course, by this point, he's a man in his 70s. And I guess it seems that Sir Fulke believed that life was a preparation for death. Wouldn't you agree?
I haven't talked too much about it, but I think Greville's later writings and the various treatises he wrote too on subjects such as religion, monarchy, fame and honour, and human learning all point towards the great thoughts that this elderly gentleman, an elderly courtier, had experienced throughout his life. And one of the overriding principles of this was influenced by his, I think, very severe quasi-Calvinist thought, which really expressed in his mind that there was this enormous gulf between God and man, that man is absolutely imbued with corruptive powers, which I've already vaguely alluded to. The fact that man's desires, his thirst for fame and honour, will ultimately always lead him to corruption. And this was his experience at court. He had lived a very long life. Again, 74 years old. He must have been considered, I think, quite a sage by the time he died. But throughout his experience of the court of Elizabeth and also that of James, the early years of Charles too, he had witnessed many, many failed opportunities. And slowly hope, I think, was starting to die within him, which is quite sad to imagine. But his last poems are filled with such pessimism, I think, which started right at the beginning of the 17th century, but really does mature in a way that calls to mind this idea of life, as you put it, being a complete preparation for death. He was so interested, I think, in producing something that would outlive him, which would probably be, in his thoughts, his writing. And this is one of the curious things, that only a few of his poems were ever published in his lifetime, but he was amassing this enormous amount of treatises, texts, and sonnets, which were never published in his lifetime. So who is he writing it for? I think is the great mystery of his life. And I think it is really written for posterity, for all future generations, texts to read and to understand the difficulties that man faces in life. I think one of my favourite lines that he ever wrote actually was written in one of his plays entitled Mustafa, which explains the wearisome condition of humanity, that we are born under one law, but yet to another bound. The idea that we are born unto the law of God, but we are also human, that we are imbued with sin. In other words, in his words, in fact, we are created sick, but commanded to be sound, this impossible situation that humans are put under. And indeed, this is one of the reasons I think that Fulke Greville is such an interesting thinker and philosopher. He started to ask questions about the condition of man that really were only going to be answered or posed again in a serious way into the 18th and also 19th centuries. So I think this is another very important reason why he should be remembered. And I hope this podcast is something of an introduction to people who might have never heard of him before.
So I guess if Fulke did believe in this idea of posterity and monumentality, I guess his tomb is probably the best symbol of that.
His tomb, which survives in the chapter house of St. Mary's Church in Warwick, is an absolutely marvellous piece of architecture. We know that 10 years before he died, he started thinking about how his life would be immortalised. He had first thought about being buried in St. Paul's Cathedral in London, buried underneath his great friend, Sir Philip Sidney, who he had never forgotten, in some elaborate tomb featuring gilded pillars and things like that. Very complicated, very fancy. But it seems that this idea was scrapped. And in 1618, he made a contract with a a stone carver in London called Thomas Ashby, who was known for actually working with Inigo Jones. And this is one of the reasons that some architectural historians have suggested that Inigo Jones actually designed this very surviving tomb. And it is so curious, isn't it? The colours, the white and alabaster and black toothstone, which time unfortunately has turned very yellow, is so striking. And this very curious mixture of Corinthian columns, round vaulted arches, which support an almost tomb above his sarcophagus, which is in black underneath it. It is so curious that it has set off so many varying conspiracy theories about what exactly he intended by it. But most curious of all is the inscription that remains on his sarcophagus. It is written, Fulke Greville, servant to Queen Elizabeth, Councillor to King James, and finally, friend to Philip Sidney. In this inscription, we have the reminder of the most important relationships of his life. And I think that final line of friend to Philip Sidney, I think, is one of the most touching of all. All of these decades on, he still remembers that great Protestant heroic youth who really he looked towards for inspiration right into old age. Another key line I didn't mention is another line written in Latin, actually engraved, carved into the sarcophagus itself, which reads Trophaeum Peccati, which in translation means sin's trophy, or trophy of sin. This enormous tomb is a lasting reminder of a life which he believed was an utter failure. And this is one of the things we have to remember about Fulke Greville, due to his line of thought, his religion, his experience of man and its corrupting powers, and also in his own experience of feelings of love and desire. He felt that his life was an absolute failure, and all this wealth, all that what he accumulated in life, this tomb was a trophy of that sinful life that he had led, which I think is, again, such a pessimistic final full stop. I wonder if he could have ever imagined that so many hundreds of years later, people would still be coming to look, see, and admire, and I hope learn from too.
So I guess in the end, then the question to ask is, what should we make of this man's legacy? As a Warwickshire man, as an owner of Warwick Castle, a thinker, a courtier. How would you best sum up his legacy?
Well, it's an absolutely impossible task, I have to admit to you, and I think that's one of the reasons that so many eccentric scholars, such as myself, are absolutely fascinated with him, because he is such a complex gentleman. If only more of his letters survive, I think they would have given us such a great insight into his thoughts. But he really did achieve so much. In Warwickshire, he saved Warwick Castle. In the court of Elizabeth and James, he had experienced firsthand the rise and fall of these heroic figures, such as Essex and, of course, his immortal friend Sidney. But most of all, and I've definitely come to feel this later on as I've spent many years reading his text, that his writings, I think, including his love sonnets and his later religious works, are filled with profound meaning that still give me, at least, a great deal to learn from and to admire, despite the fact that he died nearly 400 years ago. And I would encourage anybody interested in his life to read a bit of it. He, of course, was writing sonnets at the same time as Shakespeare, but Fulke Greville's poetry doesn't lend itself very well to an impressionistic reading. You have to battle with it. You have to really try and raise yourself to his level of education. But if you do, I can assure you that it is very much worth it.